sound of the shaker ray and the sound of the drums means that it's time for the Griot Storytelling Circle. Welcome. I'm Sister Martha Ruff, and this is the Griot Storytelling Circle, a time for us to talk about things that are all about Laurel and all about storytelling. Today we're going to look at the African American experience. In January we have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and in February we celebrate African American history. This is a time to look at those things that have been given to us by those citizens of color who have made our country even better. But we want to remember where they started, where they began, in Africa. Now, Africa is a continent, and there are many countries. And one country brings us something that many people enjoy today: kente cloth. This beautiful cloth, made with lots of colors, is made in Ghana, which is on the west coast of Africa. And there you will find many African Americans have ancestors from that country, that part of Africa. And this fabric, many of us wear it today to remember our African heritage. Now, how did kente cloth come about? Well, there is a story. And the story tells how kente cloth was made. There was a village, a small village, but a village that everyone feared because it had a mighty warrior in that village. Kwame was the warrior who protected their village. He was good at throwing spears, and he had an ear that listened for things coming in the night. And as the men went out to look for food for their village, Kwame was always in the lead. He would take them out and they would hunt. And his spear was always right on target. And everyone looked up to him as the leader of their village. One day, Kwame went out alone to hunt, to practice, and it was then that he was injured by a lion who he was able to get away from. But as he did, he looked at his arm, and his arm was hanging off by his side. And never again did Kwame's arm become strong again. His arm that he used to throw with, his arm that he would hail to his men to follow him. And no longer was he the leader of their village. What could he do? How could he make a living? Kwame went out and sat in the woods thinking about his life and what was left of it. And as he sat there in the woods, his attention was drawn to a spider that came hanging down on a limb near him. And then the spider went up again and down. And after a few minutes of watching, Kwame saw the beautiful web that the spider had woven. Ha! That spider, even that little tiny spider, has a purpose in life, said Kwame. Maybe I still do too. And going back home, Kwame thought about that spider going up and down and creating a beautiful web. And Kwame said, I could do that. And so he did. He took some yarn and soon he had a piece of cloth that was beautiful. Even his wife liked it. Yes, said his wife, I could sell this to the other women. Will you make some more? And so Kwame did. Following the same example of that spider, he soon was making cloth that everyone wanted. And from that day until this very day, they call that special cloth kente. And the kings would wear it, and today African Americans wear it to remember their African heritage. And just like Kwame, you too can find your purpose in life, no matter what happens to you. Ashe, we say at the end of our story. You can read more about kente cloth. There is a Maryland author who has written a book called The Spider Weaver by Margaret Musgrove. And Margaret Musgrove is an award-winning children's book author who lives here in Maryland. And this is another story telling how kente cloth came to be. One organization that is the sponsor of African American History Month is Asala, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Asala gives the theme for each African American History Year. And this year, the theme is Memories of Historic Sites. Have you ever thought about traveling to places where historic African American events have taken place? Well, you can do that, and not too far from Laurel. You can go right down the road to Washington, D.C. and visit Frederick Douglass's house. Or you could go to the Eastern Shore and visit the place where Harriet Tubman left and escaped from being held in slavery. You can find out more about those places and other places across our country in this book called On the Road to Freedom by Charles Cobb Jr. And he tells us all of those places, special places that have special significance in African American history. This is like a tour guide, a tour book to those places that you want you and your children to know about. Well, don't forget to celebrate Dr. King's birthday. We like to think of it as a day on, a day to serve, and remembering that Dr. King's birthday is January the 15th. We know that we celebrate it on the third Monday, but it's always nice to remember the actual date. And one way you can remember Dr. King's birthday is to share some poetry. And this book, Followers of the North Star, is a book that shares some poetry about lots of African Americans and their contributions. And one of them is Dr. King. And we hear Martin Luther King Jr. They tried to kill the dream when they shot down Dr. King, But the dream he preached remains alive in spite of everything. The dream of equal justice, of freedom, liberty, the dream that all the world can live as one community in spite of all the hatred, suspicion, rage, and strife. The dream is there for all who seek to find a better life. Though Martin Luther King Jr. is dead, the dream he preached lives still in hearts of all good people, and there it always will. And this is a poem about Martin Luther King Jr. in this book, Followers of the North Star. And you'll want to read it and other biographies, poems about other African American heroes. Now, here in Laurel and in Maryland, we celebrate some African Americans who made a difference in our country. Frederick Douglass escaped to freedom from Maryland, and then he became an abolitionist to speak out against slavery. He was a great orator, and he had a house that is now a museum in Washington, D.C. And the other hero that we remember in Maryland is Harriet Tubman. And she escaped to freedom from Maryland. And her place that she escaped from is becoming a national park soon. So be on the lookout for announcements about that opening. But also remember this wonderful book, Moses by Carol Boston Weatherford, is a one way to share the story of Harriet Tubman. And this is an award-winning book. It has won the Caldecott Honor Award, which is an award for an outstanding children's illustrated book, and the Coretta Scott King Award book, which is an outstanding book that is a contribution to African American literature for young people. And with this book, Carol Boston Weatherford looks at the spiritual journey that Harriet Tubman took as she made her way to freedom. And of course, the wonderful illustrations of Kadir Nelson, the award-winning illustrator, tell us this story. And we see Harriet Tubman as she is held in slavery, a little girl. And she's out in the night thinking about how she can make a difference, how she can do what is right for her. She's looking at the North Star. And you know that many people held in slavery used the North Star to make their escape. But we know that there were lots of things that Harriet Tubman had to go through to get to freedom. How she had to go for days without water or food. And she got some help from people on what we call the Underground Railroad, those people who helped people find their way to freedom. And she did find her way to freedom. And we remember that she also helped over 300 people find their way to freedom too. And just like Moses in the Bible, Harriet Tubman led people to freedom. And that's why she is called Moses. And that's why when her life was done, we know that it was said, Well done, Moses. Well done, Harriet. Well done. And you can read the story of Moses by Carol Boston Weatherford. In Laurel, we are happy that there are many storytellers and griots who can share with us. And today we have another griot who's going to share with us. June Maccabee is another Laurel griot, and she's going to share some African American stories. Please welcome June Maccabee.
Thank you so much, Martha, for inviting me to be a part of this Black History program. My story today is about a slave, a very important slave. His name was John, and everybody called him High John the Conqueror because he was so vital and strong. He was a tall, handsome black man with muscular and very muscular, and everybody loved John. Not only because he looked good, but he always could do his work so well. One day, John was traded. He was traded to another, as they called him, master. And this was Master Bob. And the man that traded him said, I know you're going to enjoy working with him because he's so good. He's the best slave I've ever had, and I hate to part with him, but my plantation needs the money. And you can give it to him, and I ask you to treat him right, because I never had to beat him for anything. He always did his job. So he says, well, I'm glad to have him aboard. So John said, thank you, sir. And he took John home to where he was going to live. And Master Bob had a big house, big white house on stilts. And it had grass under it that you could go under the house for many things. And John was looking at everything. And as he introduced the other slaves, he said, now John is going to have a special house because he's got to do a lot of things for me. And I'm going to put him over here, but I want you to meet John. And everybody said, hello, John. And they were so interested. Of course, the women were looking at him. And they said, John, we're going to have a good time here. He says, you know, I really don't have time for anything. He said, my thing is I plan to be free. And that's what I want to be. And that's what I'm working to. And so Master Bob said, okay, John, this is where you will live. And you will be with the other slaves, but you will be right up here. So when I need you, I can get you. He said, yes, sir. So John went on into his little place, and he said, well, I know one thing. I'm not too far from the boss. And whatever he wants me to do, I'm going to be there because I am going to get my freedom from this place. Well, John worked around the house, and they would call him for different things, and he would always be there. And John used to sing, and he had a nice voice. And in the evenings, he would sit down in his little place and sing. And he would sing about being free, how I want to be free. And then he'd read his Bible because he was also a holy man. And he knew that God was going to grant him his wish. Well, one morning, John got up real early, and he saw that the Master Bob and his wife were sitting on their porch rocking and talking. So he said, I wonder what they're talking about. So he decided he was going to crawl under the house. And while he was under there, he dropped his watch. Now, this was a special watch that his father had given him. And he said, John, keep this watch close to your heart. This is the only thing of value I can give you, and it's gold. And when you think of me, you remember that this is the best thing that I could ever give you. He said, but always do your work well, and so we can be proud of you. So he remembered that. And he dropped that watch out of his pocket, and it went down on the ground. And so John decided he was going to go under the house and see if he could find it. So when he went under the house, he saw that Master Bob and his wife were talking. So he decided, Well, I'll look and see if I can find that watch. And he looked on down there and he found the watch. He said, got it. But he said, let me hear what they're saying. So Master Bob said to his wife, tomorrow I'm going to ask John to hook up the horses and we're going to go to town. And she said, well, Bob, would you bring me back some nice red material? He said, because I'm going to have Eva, my slave, to make me a dress for the party that they're going to have Friday night. So he said, sure, I'll bring that back and I'll get the supplies and I'll get John early in the morning to take us. So he said, oh, and John listened very carefully. He said, okay. So early the next morning, John was there and he had the horses hooked up and he was sitting there early in the morning. And Bob came out and said, John, what are those horses hooked up for? He said, well, sir, I knew you wanted to take them to town and you wanted to get me to get some supplies with you. He said, how could you have known that? He said, just smart, I guess. So he said, all right. So he got him in there and he took him on. He said, John, you know, you're special. He said, yes, sir. My daddy always told me I was special. And they were just driving along talking. He said, I'm so glad I have you because you do everything that I ask you to do. He said, yes, sir. That's my job. He said, John, what do you want to do? He said, I know what I want to do. I want to be free. He said, oh, no, you don't. He said, yes, I do. That's what I'm working toward. He said, well, John, I hope you won't. I don't want you to be free because I want you to work for me. He said, yes, but I want to be free. So anyhow, they got there and he says, now I'm going to eat with my buddies. And I want you, John, to get all the supplies set up and you can go on and find some place to eat too. So he said, and then when we get ready, we'll go back. So he said, all right, sir. So the guys went over to eat with John. There were some other slaves there. And then there was a group of men that Master Bob knew. And he went over and he sat down and he started talking about it. He says, you know, I've got the best slave in the world. He said, he's so smart. He knows what I want to do before I even do it. So I said, oh, come on, Bob. You just trying to brag. He said, no. He said, you know, he knew I wanted to come down here, and I never told him. He said, oh, come on. He said, yes, he's smart. He's smart. He said, okay, we'll see. So anyhow, it got time for them to go back. And he said, come on, John, let's go. And so they drove back. And he said, well, thank you for helping me out and everything today. He says, I'm glad to do it, sir. So he said, you put the supplies up, and we may have to go back to town another day. So he said, yes, sir. So he went on and put everything up. And so the next day, Bob said, you know, I think I need to go back and get something else. So he said, all right. He said, I'll tell John to hook up the horses again. And John was under there listening. He heard that. He said, okay, I'll have it ready when he gets there. So next morning he came out and John had everything ready. He said, John, I didn't tell you I was coming back, did I? He said, no, but I just knew that you wanted. He says, good. So he said, all right. So they're driving along. He said, John, have you worked for many people? He said, yes, sir. He said, have you always done your job as well? He said, yes, sir. I believe in doing my job the best I can. He said, well, you sure doing it. So they met again, and they said, you still bragging about your slave? He said, yeah, he's smart. He knew I was coming today, and I didn't even have to tell him. He said, oh, yeah. He said, you know, I could put something in a bag, and John would remember it. He would know what was in that bag. So I said, oh, no. He said, I can prove it. I'll get a bag, and I'll put something in. You guys come on over. And see, he said, oh, you think we're going to fall for that? Well, let us put something in the bag, and then let him guess it. He said, well, all right, that'll work. So he said, okay. So then he got on back, as he's going back home, he said to John, I was bragging on you today. He says, yes. What were you bragging about? He said, I told those guys that I could put something in the bag, or they could put something in the bag, and you could guess what it was. John said, what? He said, yeah, I told him, because that's the, I just have so much faith in you. John said, I don't think you should have done that, sir. He said, why? He said, I have faith in you, John. I know you can do it. So John said, when are they coming? He said, well, they're going to be there this afternoon. I told them to come this afternoon because you weren't too busy this afternoon. And I figured about 4 o'clock, you know, that's when all your work is done, and we'll have all the slaves come out, and all the people in our on our plantation will come and see you do this. So he said, oh, okay, sir, okay. So he said, and they're going to put something in the box, and all you have to do is not open that box, just tell them what's in there. John said, yes, I hear you, sir. So John was upset. He said, oh, my goodness. Lord, he just prayed. He said, Lord, I'm sorry. I've been fooling that man. He said, but you got to help me, Lord. He said, because you know I can't tell what's going to be in that box. He said, you got to help me, Lord. He said, I just forgive me for all my sins. And he said, oh, Lord, what am I going to do? Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus. And he just prayed and everything. And he said, if I never needed the Lord before, sure do need him now. Oh, sure do need him now. Oh, I sure do need you now. If I never needed the Lord before, sure do need you now. I need you every day and every hour. So John said, okay, Lord, got to help me this time. And you know I'm your servant. So time came for them to come out there. And John said, all right, Lord, help me. So all the men came and they had this box. And they brought it out there. And they said, is John over there? So one of the ladies said, the slave said, I'll go get him. So she went and knocked on the door. Said, John, they want you out there. He said, yes, I know. I'm coming. So the men brought the box out and said, John, we heard that you could guess what's in a box before it's opened. And John says, yes. He said, well, we brought the box, and you can shake it, do anything you want with it, but you can't open it. And you got to tell us what's in the box. So John came up, and he took the box, and he said, oh, Lord. He's just praying to himself, Lord, you know I need you now. Tell me what's in the box. And he heard a voice say, well, John, what do you think's in the box? John said, I don't know, Lord. That's why I'm asking you. He said, well, the Lord said, it's something that can fly. So he said, well, lots of things can fly, Lord, you know. He said, just think, John, what could be in the box that could fly? So he shook it a little bit, and he heard a little fluttering inside. And he said, He said, well, I think that it's a bird. And so slowly he opened the box lid, and out flew a bird. And everybody said, yes, he won. He did it. He did it. He did it. And the master was so happy. He said, I told you about my John. I told you what was going to be in that. He knew what's going to be in that box. He said, now you all owe me $500 because that's what they had planned. If he won, if Bob won, he would get $500. If he did not win, they would have to pay. John would have to pay them $500. Bob would have to pay them $500. So he was so happy. He just ran up there and hugged John around his neck and said, oh, John, thank you, thank you, thank you. So John said, now, what do you plan to do for me? He said, anything you want, John. He said, yes. You mean that? Yes, yes, yes. My friends, I proved that they were wrong and I was right, and I've got $500. If you want any of that money, you can have it. He said, I'll be up there to talk to you. So he said, all right, John. So the other guy said, okay, he's really good. You got him. You got us this time. So the men went away, and all of the slaves were just happy and happy and happy. And they said, John, John, you did it. You did it. He said, yes. He said, what is he going to give you? Is he going to give you some of the money? He said, I don't know, but I know what I asked him for. So he said, what'd you ask him for? He said, I asked him for my freedom. He said, what? He said, anything you want. And that's what I want. I'm going up there and see him. I'm going to have my clothes packed. And when I get up there, I'm going to say, all right, give me my papers. So they said, oh, John, you going to leave us? I said, yes, indeed. Sure as my name is John Conqueror, I'm going to leave you. So he went back to his house, and he got everything, got his little watch together, and all of the things that he needed. And he went up and he knocked on the door. And Master Bob said, come on in, John. I know it's you. So he said, yes, sir. He said, now, how much money do you want? He said, I don't need no money. He said, what you mean you don't need any money? Well, I promised I would give you anything you wanted. He said, yes, and I'm waiting for my papers. I want my freedom papers. He said, John, no, please, John, don't leave us. He said, that was the agreement. You said I could have anything I want, and I want my papers. My clothes are packed, and I'm ready to go. So he said, John, I think we ought to talk about this. He said, there's nothing to talk about. You said anything I wanted, and what I want is my freedom papers so I can go. So he said, well, John, I guess I have to. That was my thought to you, that I would do that. So he said, just wait a few minutes. So he went in the back and he told his wife. And she said, oh, no, he's not going to leave, is he? Said, well, that's what I promised him. I promised him anything he wanted. So she said, John, don't leave us. Don't leave us. You've been the best slave we've ever had. You just do everything for us. He said, well, you promised. We made a promise and we shook on it. So I am going to leave and I want my papers. So he said, all right. So he went back and he wrote out the papers and they gave them to John. He said, John, may God bless you. And he gave it to him. And he said, thank you, sir. And he looked back and he told everybody, goodbye. I've got my freedom. And he just started singing, oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to be free with the Lord. And he walked on out, and John became a free man. And that's the end of my story. It's so good to see you, and thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the story, too.
Thank you. See you next time.
Okay.
We'll see you next time.